Let's have a look at one aspect of the law that has always been contentious, and that is progress claims and how they're administered under contracts. So, as we all know, construction projects are usually of massive values, and it is not expected of contractors, i.e., builders, to be financing the whole project. And that's why there's a need of constant cash flows to be paid to these contractors. Now, all standard forms of construction contracts, they include provisions for progress payments to be made to these contractors. And an interval, a specific interval, is usually specified in these contracts. An example of a provision in one of these standard form contracts is AS 4000, clause 37. There's one important point that we have to be aware of, and that is the fact that the standard form contracts haven't been amended to reflect the requirements of the security of payments legislation. So there will be provisions that specify certain dates for payments under the standard form contracts that are not in alignment with the Act. And in these instances, we always would comply with the Act rather than the standard form contract. How is the process sort of set up? Well, there are three main steps for a progress claim process. Payment to be made. Step number one is the payment claim, the submission of the payment claim. Step number two is the payment certificate. And then step number three is the payment that's made finally by the principal. Let's have a look at each of these steps individually. Step number one, the payment claim. Some terminology that we need to be aware of. The claimant, in this case, would be the person that's entitled to the progress payment. So they give or they issue the payment claim to the person that's liable to make the payment, i.e. the respondent. It's important that the claimant identifies the construction work to which the progress claim relates, and this has been underlined in this very important case that you see in front of you, New South Wales case. So, as I said, the claimant needs to submit the payment claim. Let's just assume that the claimant over here is the contractor, i.e. the builder, and they need to make this submission, the payment claim. The standard form contract would set out specifications for information that the builder, in this case the claimant, needs to include in the payment claim. And examples of information that has to be included is shown on the screen in front of you. So estimated value of works, including variations. So the builder has to get an accurate estimate of the works that they completed and for which they're requesting a payment to be made. And also specify the amount of retention as agreed upon in the contract. So remember, the retention is the amount that the principal would keep until the end of the project to make sure that, in the case that the contractor does not fix any of the defects, then the principal still has money, the retention amount, to spend on solving these defects. So that was for step number one. Step number two. Over here, we're talking about the progress certificate now in step number two. So the claimant has already made the claim, the progress claim for the payment. Step number two involves an independent party, referred to as the superintendent. And the superintendent can be your engineer, your architect, for example. And this third party would administer the payment claim. So what they would do is they would assess the value of the progress payment. So the progress payment that they received from the contractor, from the builder, they will have a look at it, and then they would look at the works that have been undertaken and then determine whether it's of the correct value that's requested or not. So once they've determined what the actual value is, they issue the progress certificate. So the superintendent issues the progress certificate, And in that progress certificate, it would specify the amount that the contractor should be paid. Let's have a look at a provision, a very relevant provision in one of the standard forms, the common standard forms that are used, AS4000. Particularly looking at clause 37.2. And the clause, you see it in front of you on the screens. I've highlighted the important bits. So the clause says that the superintendent shall, within 14 days after receiving the progress claim, issue to the principal and the contractor a progress certificate. So the amount of days are specified as 14 days. Now, as I said, these provisions do not reflect the requirements that are set out in the Security of Payment Act. And as we all know, it's always important to stick to the Act. So the Act over here dominates any of the other sort of provisions in contracts, in standard form contracts. But at AS4000, as I said in the example, demonstrates the number of days that a superintendent needs to abide by when submitting their progress claims to the principal and the contractor. Now, the final step number 3, of course, is the payment that has to be made by the principal. So the principal now received the certificate from the superintendent, and they have an obligation now. Once they receive the certificate, there is an obligation to pay the amount that's shown in the certificate. Again, clause 37.2 of AS4000 specifies that the principal has 7 days after receiving the certificate to pay the amount, or another date is specified, which is 21 days after the superintendent receives the progress claim. So in the instance that the superintendent doesn't issue the certificate to the principal, then there's the 21 days that are specified, and after which a payment has to be made to the contractor by the principal. Some issues pertaining to step number 3, which is the payment. So the first question over here that I had specified is, can the principal still sue even after paying the progress certificate? So what I'm trying to say over here is that would the fact that the principal paid the amount specified in the progress certificate indicate that the principal agrees with the works, that they had no issues, and that's why they made the payment? Well, answering this question as to whether the principal can still sue, the answer is yes. And it's because the payment that's made by the principal is not an indication in this instance of acceptance of the works. So the superintendent still, or the principal, sorry, still has the opportunity to contest the works that had been undertaken, even though they'd already made the payment. And if they wanted to contest, the amount that's specified in the progress certificate, even after they'd paid it, then they'd have to refer to the dispute resolution clause. Now, each contract has a dispute resolution clause, or a set of clauses that specify how disputes that arise, mostly between the principal and the contractor with regards to payments, how these disputes would be resolved. And these are referred to as the dispute resolution clauses. And so the principal over here would have to act in accordance with these resolution clauses that both parties agreed to. Again, AS4000, clause 37.2, specifically mentions, neither a progress certificate nor payment of money shall be evidence that the work under contract has been carried out satisfactorily. So it's not evidence that the principal accepted the works, even though they made the payment. Another important question is, what happens when the superintendent does not issue the required certificate within the nominated period of time in the contract? So remember, in AS4000, we said that the nominated period of time was 7 days. So what happens if the superintendent does not issue the certificate within that period of time? Well, in this instance, the progress claim itself will be deemed to be a progress certificate. And the principal would still have to pay the amount. Even if they don't have the certificate, they have to pay the amount. The other important thing that has to be mentioned is that the principal doesn't have the authority to withhold any payment from the contractor when the contractor submits a progress payment, and that progress payment is approved through a certificate that's issued by the superintendent. So the principal can't, for example, say that because there's a defect somewhere, I'm going to withhold a certain percentage of that amount that's claimed. And this can't happen usually unless in the actual contract it was specified that this would be allowable. And an authority case is the one that you see in front of you, a New South Wales case as well. Now, finally, let's talk about lump sum contracts, because lump sum contracts are assumed as entire contracts, meaning that there's no payment usually until the final product is completed. That's the general sort of concept of an entire contract. Even in these contracts, in a lump sum contract, which is very common in the construction industry, if you add a provision in the contract that specifies that progress payments are to be made, then both parties have to respect that. And the authority case is the one that you see in front of you. When an entire contract exists, as I said, the lump sum contract, the contractor will still be able to claim for progress payments, as I said, especially if it's made as a provision in the initial contract that such progress payments are to be made. However, what happens in the case where the contractor, let's say, for example, doesn't complete the project? So there's substantial performance, what we refer to as substantial performance. So not the full product had been delivered, not the full building had been delivered to the principal, but let's say 70% of it. Is the contractor still entitled to receive payment? Well, generally, the law says that the contractor would be paid the contract amount adjusted for the cost to complete or rectify the work. So a builder delivers a project, it's 70% complete. I need to pay an additional, as an owner, I need to pay an additional $300,000 to complete the full project. So I pay the contractor whatever the value of that 70% is of the project, minus, of course, or I pay them the amount, the contract amount, minus the $300,000 that I have to pay in order to achieve a fully compliant project with the initial specifications. And the authority case in this instance is the one, a Victorian case, is the one that you see in front of you on the screen.